and it appears to have died. So we'll see if that video is actually stored. But if not, welcome to the garden. It's a nice spring video. May 12th, we're out shooting in the garden. And I think the garden is really starting to come into its own. If you're ever in the Ames area, I would recommend visiting the garden somewhere between May and mid-June, maybe early July, is when you can really tell what's going on here, and it's not completely overwhelming yet. Because July and August gets pretty hairy with the amount of diversity we have here. That's the seasonal flow. You have the breath in and the breath out of the growing season. So I was showing various things like the native tree species we have, like this elm, which is growing a little gall midge, some sort of insect growing out of the leaf, which is what we like to see here with those species. You can see the second year biennial kale, which is going to flower. You can see it's definitely related to broccoli with the flowering pattern. Tastes just like broccoli too. But yeah, hopefully we'll get some seed out of this. And you can start to see the evolution of the garden. You can see this meadow area in the middle where I have a lot of the annual radishes and carrots and spinach, lettuces, peas, parsley, cilantro, more lettuces. You can see there's some lettuces that I planted several weeks ago, like probably late March in here. And then there's other ones I planted only about a week ago. So I should have a staggered production going. You can see there's actually a walkway in between the prairie bed and this bed that I filled in with various pots over the winter. And you can see ones that I've taken out already. But the chestnuts overwintered just fine like that. You got some rubises, you got more chestnuts, mostly chestnuts in pots. So it also seems like a good year for fruiting. These plums at least appear to be putting on a lot of fruit. So if you look here, you can see one ovum that's already starting to swell. There's a lot of other ones that haven't lost their little coverings. Some fraction of them will fall off. Hopefully not 100%. Hopefully it's only, I don't know, 50%, 20%. Now, one thing that I am prepared to try this year is to spray clay. Now, anyone that's at least reasonably well versed in, I don't know, regenerative orchard circles and has tried to grow plums knows of the plum curculio. It's a native North American weevil that oviposits in plum fruits. The larva crawls into the seed, eats it, tells the fruit to abort, falls to the ground, goes into the soil, continues the life cycle, which is the circle of life. Obviously, I'm not going to use any poison because that's just sort of anti-poison, right? And it wouldn't be worth it. You'd kill all the beneficial insects and you would destroy your soil biology. So how do we deal with a relatively problematic problem? Well, there's a couple techniques. You can use animals. So if this were a farm, I'd have chickens or something that I would periodically run in, or pigs that would pick up the fallen fruits and eat the larva. That would break the life cycle. Maybe you don't kill 100% of them that way, but you kill 80%, and so you only lose a small fraction of your fruit. Well, not really possible. In my wildest moments, I've considered having chicken runs and stuff, but this is a community garden, so there's only so much we can do. And I'll show you in a second, we're already kind of pushing the bounds of that. So what people do is they have a clay spray called Surround, which is a product that somehow they've micronized clay particles. Clay particles are already quite small, but somehow they've ground these to be smaller. And supposedly, everyone says it's the only product you can use. Whenever anyone says that, I generally am skeptical. And maybe they're right, but I went into the nature in this area, and if you look in the creek beds around here, there's some clay deposits. You'll find some nice white clay. So I got some clay, and over the winter I've been hydrating it, and I got a little sprayer. So I'm gonna try to spray on some of my own clay slurry. And I don't imagine it'll be quite so good as the Surround product, but that's like $70 a bag. And this was just a good hike into a forest and hike out. So we'll see if that works. I'll let you guys know how that performs. I also might not have such a problem because last year there was only about 10 fruits on the other plum tree that is fruiting. And so if you only have 10 fruits and you have one plum curculio, it can oviposit in every one of them, you lose your whole crop. So this year, if I have 100 fruits, hopefully at least some fraction of them will get through no matter what I do. Now there's also the problem that if I put Surround on 100% of these fruits, the plum curculio might just decide it's worth it. So you kind of need a trap tree. You need to like push and pull. And so if I had an orchard, I would probably leave one on the far end of the garden that I would definitely have chickens under, and I would use Surround or use this clay product on the trees to push them away from my main crop onto a trap crop that I knew the chickens were going to take care of. A lot of these things aren't really possible in the 40 by 40 grid, but that's kind of where my head's at with these trees. Now you can notice the very well, if you just look at it, you're like, well, Reed knows nothing about pruning trees, which may be true, but is not what explains this disaster here. You may remember, if you're in Iowa, we had the derecho last year, and Ames was definitely a part of the path here. Not so bad as Cedar Rapids or things like that, but definitely a lot of fallen trees. And so I came to the garden. I was actually at the garden as the derecho was coming in, and I heard the sirens and started driving home. Kind of got caught out in the middle of it. But I came back afterwards, and this tree was starting to lift out of the ground because the wind was blowing it so much. So I sacrificed probably a good 2/3 of the canopy with a cut to anchor it into the ground and keep it from acting as a sail and blowing over. And it's recovering quite well, so that's why it looks kind of leaning. And you know, if I were really trying to make it lean in the garden, I'd probably lean it towards the sun to give this Fecwin Roan cider apple more solar aspect. Which we can see, this tree actually is flowering. I've made a few flowers. So you can see some of the older flower buds here. We'll see if they start to swell. Sometimes, like if they got fertilized and the tree decides to actually make fruit, they'll get bigger and bigger. If it didn't, they'll just turn brown and fall off. So we'll see. I'm not totally sure which way that will go. But this is the first time this tree has flowered, so it's pretty exciting. You can see some nice purple asparagus coming up through. Here's one of the stems. You could probably still eat that if you wanted to. Pretty impressive. This red currant really, in the last 2 years, have just been going really well. I got it and it was completely pot bound, and the first year it sort of languished, and I've been pruning out the dead wood, and it's really starting to become a vigorous plant. From this plant, I propagated probably 20 or 30 cuttings. Most of them are still over here. So I've got a series of pots with the Menage Meru, and this is the Red Lake red currant. So you can see these are pretty much 100% of them seems like they're taking. When they really start growing, so like this fresh growth here, that seems very promising to me. You'll see things like this. Sometimes if it's just, you know, barely leafing out, it'll have enough latent energy in the stem to do that. So, but overall, it looks really promising. Now I have a hardy kiwi here and a hardy kiwi over there. You can see the presence of some dead leaves. It was starting to leaf out beautifully, like almost 100% of the buds were leafing out, and then it got hit by that last frost. So that was a little bit unfortunate, but it is coming back. Same thing with a couple persimmons. New species of the garden. So I've got a couple persimmon species that my brother sprouted and I planted here. A couple persimmon plants, one species, though, it's called the American persimmon. The Chinese persimmon or the Asian persimmon isn't quite hardy enough for this zone, but the North American persimmon is incredibly hardy. So, and then I have some pawpaws. So here's a pawpaw here, and I also have one over in this bed. So that's exciting. I have some cornelian cherries, and I got a couple jujubes, so we'll see if those survive. I'll talk more about them. They look kind of weak right now, but I'll talk about them if they turn out to be a more interesting crop. Now, we are building a pond, which is what this is. Michael and I filled it up a couple days ago, and it's basically down to about 1 foot. So I've ordered a second liner. Somehow this one's not, it was used of 2 different pieces, and we tried to duct tape it together, and clearly there's some sort of leak, a really substantial leak. And although the soil here is quite clayey in spots, there's enough cracks in the clay, and the whole first about 1.5 feet is quite permeable, so it'll never seal itself by itself. But yeah, it should be quite fun. I've got the solar pump I've got over there that I used last year, so hopefully this turns out to be really cool. It'll obviously be wood chipped, and I'll bring some creeping thyme and maybe some oregano and other strawberry sort of vining crops or ground covering crops to, you know, beautify it, and then water lettuce to help purify the water. We'll throw some guppies or minnows or goldfish in there. So stay tuned. This will look quite good. It looks kind of janky right now, but such is the garden. This willow tree has really come back. I transplanted it last year and it was looking a bit hairy, but you can see all this fresh growth. I mean, each one of these shot up from the stem this year. So in the long term, I've seen these at ledges. They get about 30 feet tall, which is what I don't want. So I'll keep cutting it back basically to this stem, probably about this height. And maybe I'll even choose to cut it a little bit further up so it gets bushier and bushier at the top. So we'll keep it pollarded. I want to keep it in so that it's available for insects. And you can see some evidence. So these leaves kind of woven together. The same thing with this little catkin woven to this leaf. I think that is evidence of some sort of caterpillar that's making silk connecting the leaves. In the past, I found white admiral caterpillars, tussock moth caterpillars, all sorts of native insects that use this plant as a host. If you have a butterfly garden, you should consider what plants does the larva need to grow. Because you can make nectar plants, and that's good. I mean, I certainly wouldn't say you shouldn't have a flower garden, but you might consider throwing in a willow tree for the larval form that will attract the adult caterpillar for the next generation. It's a concept a lot of people don't think about. But other than that, so in general, I'll show the fruit trees have been doing well, the lettuces have been going really well. This sort of like pseudo raised bed method where we have permanent beds that this one, I haven't planted anything quite in here yet, but if you look over here, just every year, I'll pull out the worst weeds if it's bindweed or something, but usually I just cut the roots and then pile more compost on top, and then I'll plant right into that compost, usually with some sort of potting mixture just to kind of tell where I put seeds. Yeah, so there's very little weeding. It's quite water resilient and it's super easy. And at this point, the soil here is so good. Like I mean, a lot of this is compost, but you can see some silt particles, you can see some centipedes and various forms of carbon, but it's so easy to plant into versus the native soil. Well, there's no native soil here. This was some sort of construction zone that they, you know, if the city has a community garden, it's often not on the most prime land, you know, which is great because no one comes here, but and they've kind of forgotten about it. But I do really recommend this style of strategy. You don't need a full raised bed. If you want to, you can put rocks in the far side. So those are from an old farmstead up in Northwest Iowa that got torn down, which was sad, but the rocks are cool. The walking onions are really good. Been really trying to propagate a lot of those. And the way I've started harvesting these is by actually kind of just pulling away the soil and then getting garden clippers and just clipping it off at the base. And, you know, then I chop it up. The greens are totally edible. If you want to, you can pull out the bulb, but it's kind of a shallot. It has shallot and Welsh onion genetics, so it's not a huge onion anyway. And so if you just cut it off at the base, it's easier to clean and it will come back. So I think that's currently my favorite strategy for eating it. This is a Kernza plant, so that's pretty exciting. There's a research institute, I think the Land Institute, I forget the name, but they're trying to make perennial wheat. So this is a variety of intermittent wheat grass that is a few generations improved, so larger kernels. Obviously we have a couple, you know, probably a couple decades of research to get to relatively comparable size with annual wheat, but the advantage is this is perennial. So it will send roots deeper into the ground, be more drought resilient, cause less erosion in the production of it, and have other benefits as well. But, you know, wheat has been grown for several thousand years. So there's a little like catch-up period we'll have to get to for perennial wheat. But yeah, kind of exciting. That's what the grass is. I don't usually let grasses grow here. In other parts of the polyculture, you can see kind of a weird, strawberries and rhubarb work okay. Or sorry, strawberries and asparagus work okay. There is a rhubarb plant. If you're designing a guild, I would not recommend rhubarb and strawberries. Pretty incompatible, but that's what I did. So, and the rhubarb works well with the trees. So if you're thinking about the actual design elements that I'm really trying to promote, it's this apple tree and this pear tree. This one was almost dead last year. It really got confused when I transplanted it. But this year it's actually growing quite vigorously and did flower pretty well. This apple tree, I had pulled the leader just kind of towards the north side just to kind of see what would happen. And it made an open vase shape, but it seemed really complicated to prune in the long run. And I'm trying to keep it in context with this pear tree, which is quite a close spacing. So I went ahead and took a pretty aggressive cut. I took off probably half the tree here. And now this will be my main leader. I still have sort of an open vase shape. So we'll see how it goes. I basically took it down a year. Let's see what will happen. This is a cattle panel trail. It's also from my girlfriend's family's place up in Northwest Iowa. I kind of cut it in half to get it in my car. And I also have some Appios americana. So I was growing a few of the groundnut Appios americana in my corn cage last year, as well as Chinese yam. And this year there's a professor at Iowa State, and I'll post his name, because I can't remember his name, but a really nice professor, and he's one of the lead researchers on Appios americana as a crop. And so I sent him an email seeing if I could get some of his accessions, and he kindly gave me about 50 tubers. So I gave him to a few other people and planted a whole bunch here and in my little cage over there. The corn cage, I was here early this spring, and it started drizzling, so I put some boards up on top of the corn cage. And now, I don't know if the birds are in here right now, but if we come from this angle, there's a cardinal pair that started building a nest in there. So I think I'm just gonna leave the boards on for the season, or at least until their fledglings are out of the nest, because I care more about the bird than I do about marginal growing space here. And I think the vines will still be able to grow up the side even without the full sun. So that's kind of fun. It's good to see a cardinal pear growing in the garden. But yeah, so I keep trying to bring plants to my parents' place, to my girlfriend's family's place, my brother's place, Basically, if you know me, I've probably tried to give you a current. If you don't know me, come to Iowa and I'll try to give you a current. But that's really exciting. I'm really excited about the sprouts that have come up naturally. I am hoping that I see more bees soon. I don't know if you can hear the mechanical equipment in the distance, but this creek is part of a system. Basically in Iowa, most of our native habitat or residual green space is in creek valleys. That's probably true for most of the country, but Iowa especially, because it's relatively flat, we have relatively good soil. So basically you can urban sprawl anywhere you want to, or grow corn and soybeans pretty much anywhere you want to, except for river valleys, or in this case, creek valleys. But I don't know what happened. Someone on the local or state government level got a federal contract to, as far as I can tell, just mess up a bunch of trees. Maybe they're gonna dig it out or something for drainage. I tried talking to the park director and he didn't really know what the purpose was. It's for flood control, but they took out a bunch of like creek valley trees, which to me seems like it's gonna make flooding worse, and or at least erosion worse. So we'll see. But the more of the story is that project, in combination with putting a bridge that was a bike path, they're now converting it into a, I don't know, 4-lane car drive to connect a part of the city to another part of the city that's already connected with roads 2 blocks in either direction. If you can tell, I think it's a bad idea, but they're doing it. So I think that is a lesson. Technically, I didn't notice it until it started, until they came in with chainsaws and took out all the trees in the forest. But it was on the books as of several years ago. So I think that is a lesson that we all should be a little more active on our city politics level. If you're like myself, you're probably like something of a political junkie and more of a political voyeur, where you listen to a bunch of podcasts about politics but probably aren't that active. And the reality is most of the things that affect our day-to-day lives happen on the city level. And I wish I would have been able to speak up, even if it was ultimately sort of a quixotic gesture to not, you know, bulldoze the bike path to put a road that will just increase taxes, because, you know, infrastructure, you build it, you have to maintain it. So, bad idea, but I'm trying to promote the biology in this garden space because I feel like the surrounding ecosystem is becoming more impoverished. It was already relatively impoverished because, you know, we're inside of a city, but there was this nice creek forest area that stretched for several miles. And I've seen things like the rusty patch bumblebee, which is the first federally endangered bee species in the continental United States. Hawaii has like 12. But, you know, the continental United States. And I haven't seen it for a couple of years. But hope springs eternal. I think we keep increasing the flower diversity. We keep treating our soil well. And a lot of the neighbors, the garden people, you can see in another, my name's Reed, this is Reed. You can see a bergamot plant, you know, so you start having abundance, and they put in some blueberries all by themselves and a few strawberries. And that same trend is largely true. There's still people that till their whole plot every year. Which is fine. There's different strokes for different folks, but I am encouraged to see that more people are trying to plant more perennials with a more deep mulch method. And that's kind of how change goes. I think the garden is starting to look attractive enough, especially in the springtime, where people get like, oh, okay, you're trying to grow a plum tree, and I can see that you're getting onions next to it, or you can see that parsley is growing underneath it. So let's actually look real quick at one of the radical polycultures. I was talking to Michael a couple days ago. It's like, what words would you use to describe this? And there's several. The ones I would use to be the chief design would be a deep mulch method with polyculture, with the annual space being, you know, regular polyculture, and these perennial beds being pretty radical polyculture. If you're doing a market garden, I wouldn't recommend this. But if you're doing an aesthetic garden you like to walk around and listen to podcasts in, I think this is really good. So I think this is one of my favorite polycultures, because I think it makes a lot of sense. So we have our peach tree. This would be our keystone species. We have other tree elements, but these are really just support elements. So there's a silver maple and a mulberry. I think if you didn't want those, it would still be a very good polyculture, but it does add some diversity. The next things I'm really interested in are, I guess there's woody perennial, and then there's more herbaceous perennials, I think is what you call them. So in terms of woody perennial, this is a honeyberry that I propagated last year, and it's growing really well. One design failure is there's actually also a serviceberry, and so that's actually too much shrub layer. I'll probably try to keep the serviceberry just pruned down. I don't know if I'll even try to kill it, just, you know, keep it this tall, even though serviceberry wants to be 12 feet tall. But that would be too much. And then we can see bergamot, we can see some parsley that overwintered down here. We can see cup plant, which I have sort of a love-hate relationship with. There's actually a parent cup plant over there that I keep cut somewhat. We can see gray-headed coneflower on the far side. We can see various violet species I have in the middle here. The middle is actually a little bit disturbed because I pulled out some of the peach seedlings. We can see asparagus, obviously is what I'm moving around here. We can see walking onion, there's a bunch of that around. We can see coneflower, which is what most of this is, although there's also cup plant here and bergamot here. We can see strawberries, we can see garlic chives, we can see some of that same lamb's quarters that we found over in the annual garden space. We can see some currants. We can see some raspberries, which once again actually are from that patch over there. They've kind of crawled over here. There's some black-eyed Susans under there. There's a bit of garlic mustard that I'll try to pull out. There's some pickles plants. And that's at least most of it. I wouldn't be that surprised if we're missing a species or two. Oh, well, you can see a mullein plant that just came as a volunteer. So, in one pretty small, originally a roughly 6x6 grid, I don't know, what was that, about 10, 12 species? Largely productive, and not all in terms of food, although many in terms of food. Also in terms of attracting beneficial insects like the bergamot, keeping food for bees in midsummer, the coneflower same way towards later this summer, getting several different berry crops in addition to a pretty productive peach. And the peach itself, I mean, it has troubles, but the troubles are not because of the polyculture, they're because I didn't thin the peaches off of it. So that's just one example, and each one's a little bit different. I would say, you know, this one's a little bit simpler, where we have another peach tree, and there's some walking onions, but largely this is just strawberries. There are some other things, like there's some carrots that keep coming back, and there's a honeyberry that I have there, and I have a I put in some hazelnuts last year. So, but just a general thing. So you're like, okay, I want to have more than one tree per space, or I want to benefit my tree and still get another crop. I think the classic one I would offer is a tree with strawberries. And maybe if you want to, throw some walking onions in there. It's a perfectly valid combination of species. Then you'll probably get carried away like me, and then you'll be like, oh, I'll put some catnip there, I'll put a honeyberry there, I'll put some clover there, I have some asparagus coming up. But just strawberries and trees, I think is a great technique. Michael, do you think I'm missing anything for the...
No, yeah. I think combination with the first half, we're at 22 right now, so I think we're doing okay.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll send an update video soon once I have the pond actually, you know, full of water. It's a little bit sad to see a pond without water. But yeah, overall, largely good this season. You know, always a few failures, a few good things, but pretty exciting. And I hope you enjoyed the video.